we get then the transition from culture to civilization in Mesopotamia, starting with Sargon of Akkad and the rise of the Akkadians. Sargon of Akkad, who lived about 2350 BC, is the first great Napoleon Alexander figure, the first conqueror who unifies the disparate city-states of Mesopotamia into a single giant empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. He possibly may have gone, there are myths that said that he went into Cyprus as well, so it may actually have extended that far. So it was a vast Semitic empire. The Akkadians are the first Semites in history. They're the first ones to appear, and they may have been there as an ethnic group all along, intermixed with the Sumerians. Most of these civilizations come into being. When they come into being, they have ethnic diversity, usually a clash between two different cultures. In the pre-culture period of Sumer, we had the clash between the Halafians in the north. They're in the zone of eastern Anatolia, the highlands, the mountains and the forests. And in the south, we have the Samarans, who are the ancestors, I believe, of the Sumerians. They evolve into the Abadians, who are very clearly the Proto-Sumerians. And the Abadians basically dissolve and break down the culture forms of the Halafian society. The Halafian society has a characteristic, a distinct architectural form, basically the Tolos form, the proto-form of the Tolos that the Mycenaeans later inherit, where they have this conical dome-shaped structure that is central to their villages, and that you don't find in the south amongst the Obadians or the Samarans. It looks like there was a cultural collision. We have two distinct pottery styles there. The Halafian is the more conservative, very static geometrical images of mandalas, and these are the first mandalas in history, as Joseph Campbell remarks in his essay on the symbol without meaning. These are the first mandalas in history. They appear on the bottoms of these beautiful pottery, some of the finest pottery ever made in the world, and in the Samaran pottery, which is filled with what I believe to be astrological symbolism of the pole star turning in motion. The first swastikas, which show the turning of the constellations around the pole star as animal forms on the bottoms of their pottery. So it's already very, very vital and dynamic. And the Samarans invent irrigation and the plow, and they begin transforming because there's very little rain in the alluvial plateau between the Tigris and the Euphrates, because there's very little rain there, whereas the Halafians had the benefit of rain, and so they didn't have to worry about inventing irrigation as a kind of technological substitute for rain. They didn't have these pressures on them to evolve and metabolize and produce something great in accordance with Toynbee's challenge and response model. They just sat there. It's a very conservative, great mother society, the Halafians were. They have the fat, plump goddess in their pottery, whereas the Samarians and the Obadians do not. Their goddesses are very slim. For the first time in history, we get the slim, slender Inanna type already worked out. The stiff, nude death figure. Their figurines first turn up in cemeteries at places like Samarra, where we first find a cemetery at Tel Es-Sawan, about 5000 BC, where we first find a cemetery with these pottery figures buried there. At first, the pottery is alabaster, and then later it becomes actual pottery, clay pottery. And so they invented irrigation as a substitute for rain, and once they figured out how to invent irrigation, then they began to have the technology to begin to bring civilization into being. But the alluvial plateau there is resource poor. Very little wood, no metals, and most of their instruments and tools, especially in the south, of Obadian culture, which is centered on the city of Eridu, which is the city at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, in which the great god Enki was celebrated as the fish god later, 3000 BC, but here we find in some of the earliest temple forms, fish bones are found in these temples, and it's pretty good evidence then that already the god Ea, also known as Enki, is being worshipped at Eridu. The technology is everything's made out of clay. The nails are made out of clay. The tools are made out of clay. So there's no minerals here. And it looks to me like, when you look at the maps, all the natural resources necessary for the construction of civilization are in the north, in eastern Anatolia, and to the mountains, the mountainous zones to the east. And so it looks to me like the Sumerians went on vast campaigns into the north and to the east to bring back metals and minerals. They pulled them down. These Halafian round culture forms tend to be consistent with the Halafian culture. They grab them and they bring them down and then they start metabolizing all these precious gems and minerals, and you start getting 3500 BC, the cylinder seal comes in, and the cylinder seal is an early form that just precedes the advent of writing, where you have a little pictographic image on a round cylinder, and the cylinder is made out of a precious stone, none of which is native to the alluvial plateau. They would have had to come from the north. And you roll it over a piece of clay, and you've got an image that becomes your signature. This was our equivalent of the signature, and so the Sumerian would wear this cylinder around his neck as his signature. Administrative officials in temples would sign things by rolling these cylinders. Then we get also these round culture forms that start coming in with the great columns, the 3-meter round columns in the temples, in the temple complex at Uruk, as I was talking about earlier. The White Temple of Anu, the Inanna cults are up and running. The whole civilization is up and running once all these minerals and resources have been brought in, harnessed to the technology of agriculture and the plow, and everything is up and running. So it's a vast technological process of digesting the Halafian culture. So we get two different ethnicities at work there, and it's possible, who knows, the Halafians could have been Semites. They could be the ancestors of the Semites. But as far as we know, the Akkadians are there. They're part of the civilization. They're Semitic. They're a different cultural element. They have a different cultural style. And when Akkadian art and culture begins to come to the fore in the time of Sargon, the culture becomes very different. It has a very different style to it. The statues now, in contrast to the statues of early Sumerian gods and priests, the gods and priests were all bald, of Sumerian priests and gods, and they have big staring eyes, bald heads, and very often they would appear naked. Initially they would be naked, later they have clothing, but the bald thing and beardless. With the Akkadians, the statue and the artwork and the gods shift. They retain the big eyes. They have long, shaggy Semitic beards. Sargon himself, we think, is represented in a bronze mask that shows him with a long, shaggy beard, lots of hair tied back in a bun at the back of his head, and that's how their gods look. They are not bald gods. This is a different culture with different culture forms. And Sargon was not much interested in constructing temples and new buildings. He went around destroying the walls, basically dissolving the boundaries and membranes of all the different city-states so that he could arrange them and create them into a single empire. Then he put in the practice that was alien to the Sumerians of nepotism. He put all of his relatives into the high offices. This is the Semitic idea, possibly its earliest form, that it's the transmission through the blood that the noumena resides, as the idea of Shem in the Old Testament. It transmits the blood, the Semitic bloodline. It's this transmission through the blood that counts, and tracing the chronology back through the generations is an inherently Semitic characteristic. And we see it here coming in with Sargon's dynasty, the Akkadian dynasty, that lasts only for about 100 or so years before a barbarian group known as the Gudians come in and swamp and submerge the city of Akkad. The city of Akkad itself is a new city built by Sargon himself, a brand new city that did not have much in the way of an agricultural base. It's further in the north. It was not agriculturally self-sufficient. It is the first cosmopolis. We can see civilization coming in here, the shift from culture to civilization. The culture forms are beginning to stiffen up. And Akkad was a city based on international trade. Everything is coming in from all four quarters now as Sargon has created this empire. And its commerce, it's not self-sufficient, its commerce is coming from everywhere. It has a very poor agricultural base. And when the Gudians come in and they swamp this society, they destroy it, they disrupt the canals, they flood the canals, break them, wreck them, and they wreck the roads and disrupt the communication systems, and that's it for the Akkadians. They fall apart and the civilization collapses. We're in the sort of 19th century here, period of the French Revolution equivalent, the rise of civilization in the cosmopolis. Then we get to the third dynasty of Ur, 2000 BC, and we get this last gasp of the Sumerian civilization, which is a dynasty that only lasts for 100 years, roughly, from about 2100 to 2000 BC, roughly. And for the first time, all the myths are written down. All the ancient Gilgamesh tales are written down and collected. All the myths of Inanna's descent to the underworld, the myths having to do with Enki, and the flood myths, are all gathered up and collected by the third dynasty of Ur. Ur is the great moon city. And it's in this period that we begin to get the harvesting. The entire culture now is conservative and backward looking. There's a sense that there's a twilight, a Götterdämmerung that's beginning to happen to the civilization. I think the people in the cultural intelligentsia knew this, and that's why they began to commit all of their cultural treasures to writing now for the first time, just as it's on the eve of its disappearance. And indeed, by 2000 BC, the third dynasty of Ur is done and over with, and there are more civil wars that happen. And then by the time the Babylonians come along with Hammurabi in 1790 BC, roughly, we begin to get the formation of the Caesars, basically what corresponds to Spengler's idea of the Caesars. The Babylonians are the Romans. They create this great vast empire, and they are the last great floraison of a kind of literary period of the Mesopotamian civilization. We get the creation during this time, for the first time, of the Gilgamesh epic. The epic had not existed for the Sumerians. They were just anecdotal, separate, incidental stories of Gilgamesh. Now they're put together by some scribe whose name we don't know. This is the old Babylonian Gilgamesh epic. It's put together in Babylon, as well as lots of other myths and tales that are written down. This is it corresponds to the sort of the golden and silver ages of Augustus and Nero, with the writers and poets and artists Virgil and Horace and Livy and Ovid and that kind of thing. Then after the Babylonians wind down, we get the dynasty of the Kassites, and the Kassites last for a very long time, 1500 BC to about 1200 BC, and they're entirely military men. And if you look at the reigns of the rulers, they're very short, 5 years for this one, 3 years for that one. So the Praetorian guards, as it were assassinating the emperors, just as in the case of the Romans that Tacitus writes about. They were assassinated, and the Kassites had no literary ability whatsoever. The few literary men they produced were editors and scribes and copyists. And it's to a scribe named Sinleki Unini. Sinleki Unini is named after the moon god Sin, who creates the standard Babylonian version of the Gilgamesh epic around 1200 BC, which is basically unchanged from the earlier, something like 5 centuries have passed from the old Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, and yet there's no change except for the fact that Sinleki Unini has added a prologue. He's a compiler, a scribe, just like Ptolemy and Galen, and then later Macrobius and Diodorus Siculus, Sextus Empiricus. These men are not creators. They are scribes, they are editors, they are commentators, because the creative energy has wound down from the civilization. And here in the Kassite period, we see the same phenomenon. The Kassites are followed by the very Roman militarists, the Assyrians and their dynasty. They weren't particularly literarily adept either, more so than the Kassites, but their literature doesn't amount to much. And so that's the basic morphological analogs to classical civilization amongst the Mesopotamians. So we look at the Chinese very briefly. Spengler says that the shift with the Chinese in the period of the contending states, which begins in China about 480 BC, just shortly after the time of Confucius, marks the demarcation point in the shift from culture to civilization there. This lasts for a couple of centuries until by 220 BC we get with the rise of the Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, the creation of a Roman Empire. Qin Shi Huangdi is the first Augustus, as it were, and it's in his reign that the Great Wall is constructed. This corresponds to the construction in the emperors immediately following Augustus, after the death of Varus in 9 AD, that the limes are built, the Roman walls demarcating, setting up the borders to keep the barbarians out. That corresponds to the construction of the Great Wall here. These periods then correspond in Egyptian civilization to the Hyksos period. The Hyksos period is a period of social chaos, these barbarian invasions that come in, that corresponds to the period of Alexander, the period of the contending states, Napoleon in our case, the period of the meltdown of the culture, and then from out of this, the response to the Hyksos will be the creation of the new empire, when Egypt expands into the Middle East and creates an empire after expelling the Hyksos under Ahmosa and Ka-Mosa. And then we get the great Egyptian New Kingdom, which is its great Roman period, as it were. In Mesoamerica, Spengler says that the Aztecs then correspond to the Roman phenomenon. 960 AD is about the period of it's the twilight of Mayan civilization. 900 AD is the period when Mayan civilization is in process of collapsing. We're not sure exactly to this day still what happened to the Maya. It may have been an environmental catastrophe. We're not sure. But the cities become depopulated and the whole thing winds down by 900 AD. And then by the time of the coming of the Aztecs, around 1325 AD, These are military men like the Romans. They come in and they build the first great cosmopolis with Tenochtitlan. This is a great international, multi-ethnic cosmopolis, speaking with everyone, lots of languages and tongues and so forth that is spoken by these peoples. And